Welcome. You're about to view Natural Allies, Working with Nature to Combat Climate Change. I'm Joan Rudishan, one of the event organizers. This Natural Allies Zoom panel was the seventh discussion in a series of 8 called Climate Wednesdays, Solutions for a Cooler Brooklyn, presented by 350 Brooklyn and the Brooklyn Public Library. 350 Brooklyn, the local affiliate of the international grassroots climate group 350.org, aimed to inform Brooklynites about the climate crisis and offer practical ways for citizens to get involved. Shay Betts, librarian at the Brooklyn Public Library, offered a welcome, and our moderator, Eugenia Naramaciel, introduced the 4 panelists: Jaleesa Gilmore of the NYC Environmental Justice Alliance, NEJA, Ceci Pineda of Brooklyn Rot, Alan Burchel from the design firm Urbanstrong, and Nikita Scott from Surfrider NYC. Eugenia Naramaciel, who uses the pronoun she, her, is clinical associate professor in global liberal studies at New York University. She holds MA and PhD degrees in ecology, evolution, and environmental biology from Columbia University. Her research focuses on conservation biology, aquatic biodiversity, and endangered species, as well as urban ecology. Her work ranges geographically from the Pacific Ocean to the Bronx River estuary. She's a visiting scientist at the American Museum of Natural History and chairs the Sustainability, Health, and the Environment concentration at NYU. Now the recording of the Natural Allies panel begins, just after Sari Carroll from 350 Brooklyn completes the introduction of Genia.
Thank you, Sari. It's so nice to be here, and it's a pleasure to introduce our first speaker, who is Jaleesa Gilmore. Her pronouns are she, her. She is the research analyst at the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, NYC-EJA. Jaleesa leads NYC-EJA's Waterfront Justice Project, a citywide community-based resilience campaign to address climate change impacts in New York City's industrial waterfront while promoting local industrial jobs. Her other work includes research and advocacy on air quality, green infrastructure, and extreme heat to promote equitable environmental conditions in New York City communities. Jaleesa is active with NYC-EJA's Grassroots Action for Green Infrastructure Equity, GAGE, a project promoting nature-based solutions as a key climate adaptation strategy that can increase community resilience to climate change in New York City. Jaleesa has an MPH in Environmental Health Sciences from Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health with a certificate in climate change and human health. So I'll hand it over to Jaleesa.
Hi everyone, I'm Jaleesa Gilmore, the research analyst at the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. Thank you to 350 Brooklyn and the Brooklyn Public Library for inviting me to talk about the intersections of environmental justice, climate change, and nature-based solutions. So the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance is a coalition of 11 grassroots organizations from New York City's most environmentally overburdened communities, areas that have dealt with the disproportionate siting of noxious facilities, including waste transfer stations, power plants, highways, as well as the lack of environmental amenities like green space. NEJA was founded by community-based organizations from low-income communities and communities of color to address common environmental justice issues that arise in their communities and advocate for improved environmental policy. And I just wanted to know about why these issues are important to me. I've always had an interest in protecting the environment. I grew more and more concerned with climate change and what we were doing to our planet. But more importantly, I was concerned with how climate change and pollution in general were affecting people and health. And so as I learned more about environmental health and public health, In general, it was really apparent that people of color experienced the worst health outcomes. So I really wanted to focus my work on where the need is most urgent, and at NEJA, I'm able to do so. As you're aware, the climate is changing and environmental justice communities are on the front lines, already experiencing its effects. People of color, indigenous communities, and low-income communities experience these climate impacts first and worst. But environmental justice communities have been fighting against environmental racism for decades and are already working towards climate justice. NEJA describes in our New York City Climate Justice Agenda reports how environmental justice communities in New York City are working towards addressing climate change. There are many ways that EJ, or environmental justice communities, are doing this work, but today I wanted to focus on some of the nature-based solutions that we are advocating for. So NEJA's Grassroots Action for Green Infrastructure Equity, or GAGE, is a project that promotes nature-based solutions as a key climate adaptation strategy that can increase community resilience to climate change. Green infrastructure primarily focuses on natural systems and man-made systems that focus on controlling stormwater rather than depending on traditional gray infrastructure. And when I'm talking about green infrastructure and nature-based solutions, I'm referring to rain gardens, green roofs, trees, living shorelines, coastal wetlands, parks, and community gardens. And so NEJA, we are advocating for these solutions because not only do they control stormwater, but provide a number of co-benefits like extreme heat mitigation, improving air quality and water quality, as well as enhancing coastal resiliency and fostering community cohesion. And so GAGE's goal is to increase green infrastructure in low-income neighborhoods and communities of color citywide in order to mitigate the historic environmental burdens and maximize co-benefits of green infrastructure. Extreme heat is a climate impact that we all are already familiar with. 2019 was the second hottest year on record, and it's likely that 2020 is on track to be the hottest. So this map on the right shows New York City's heat vulnerability index, which is a metric that identifies neighborhoods with a higher risk for heat-related deaths. The darker the red, the more heat vulnerable these communities are. And the map on the left is tree canopy in New York City. And so the lighter green areas are neighborhoods with less tree canopy. And you can see in certain areas in North and Central Brooklyn and the South Bronx that are heat vulnerable also lack tree canopy. And so trees and tree canopy are important because they provide cooling by mitigating the urban heat island effect through shading areas and deflecting radiation from the sun and releasing moisture into the atmosphere. And so this table is just looking at the canopy coverage and demographics of the most heat vulnerable community districts in New York City. And as you can see, the tree canopy coverage for Brooklyn, all of them are below the citywide average of 22%. And these communities also have a high percentage of people of color and are all above the New York City government poverty index rate. And so as I mentioned earlier, environmental justice communities have a higher burden of polluting infrastructure as well as emitting greenhouse gases. They're also emitting co-pollutants like PM 2.5, which is associated with respiratory diseases like asthma. And so asthma hospitalization rates for parts of North Brooklyn, like Williamsburg and Bushwick, where one of our members, El Puente, is located, are double that of the rest of Brooklyn and the rest of New York City. And so whether it's street trees or trees in parks, trees can help by removing the air pollutants from the air that impacts respiratory health. And so climate change through sea level rise, flooding, and storm surge are increasingly threatening New York City's coastlines. New York City has these zones called significant maritime and industrial areas, or SMIAs. and they're designed to encourage a clustering of heavy industry and other polluting infrastructure along the waterfront, and that's what that map on the left is showing. And there are 7 of these zones in New York City. And not only are 6 of these 7 in environmental justice communities, but they're also in hurricane storm surge zones. So we began to ask what happens if a storm comes and floods these facilities, releasing chemicals into the community? What impacts would these already environmentally overburdened communities face, especially with climate change causing more frequent and intense storms? And that's the main premise of our waterfront justice project and the questions we're trying to answer. And so this is important for green infrastructure because it helps retain water, which can minimize flooding during storm events, and also making it less likely that businesses on the industrial waterfront will get flooded and release chemicals. And this infographic is just showing how we can use green infrastructure in combination with other solutions to protect or lessen flooding in the first place. So we need green infrastructure and nature-based solutions to get us to integrated climate resiliency. The water, the air, the temperature, it's all interconnected, affecting our health. So trees, parks, gardens, wetlands can help address all of these. At the same time, it brings opportunities for climate education and bringing communities together and creating new jobs. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaleesa. That was an amazingly informative presentation. So I have a question for you. What lessons, if any, are there that could be learned from the COVID-19 pandemic, environmental justice, and green space?
Yeah, so the current pandemic has exacerbated the racial and socioeconomic disparities that environmental justice advocates have been fighting against for decades. So the same communities that are experiencing the worst outcomes of COVID-19 are the most heat vulnerable communities. They're the ones with the worst air quality. And so research is showing that higher levels of air pollution has been associated with higher mortality rates from COVID-19. And additionally, a lot of extreme heat deaths occur in homes, and in a time, especially in a time when people are encouraged to social distance inside of their homes. And so people don't have air conditioning or at risk when cooling centers may be a risky place to go to. So trees and green space become even more important to provide cooling and improve air quality during this pandemic, and as well as just providing a safe space for people to be outside and enjoying nature.
Thank you. And one more question before we go on to our next speaker. Jaleesa, can you share an example of communities doing work towards community resiliency?
Yeah, so our NIJA member El Puente, who's in North Brooklyn, Southside Williamsburg, and Bushwick, last summer they launched their Our Air, or Nuestro Aire campaign, which is a grassroots campaign that focuses on air quality, public health, and community development. And one of the key components for their campaign is greening for a safer future. And they emphasize the importance of tree plantings, open space, and parks to mitigate poor air quality, extreme heat, and reduce flooding. And so through their cultural organizing, which is also an important component of their project, they found ways to engage the community on these issues, creative ways to engage the community and youth as well. And so one of those things was they performed a play about trees and its connection to air quality and environmental justice and just the importance for their community. It was just a great event to be able to let the community know about just the benefits of, you know, green infrastructure and trees, as well as the historic environmental justice issues that their community is facing.
Thank you so much. And we'll look forward to all the many questions that will be coming in the chat that we can come back to at the end of the session from the audience. So I'll move on to introduce our fantastic next speaker, Ceci Pineda, and with the pronouns they, them. Ceci finds hope in community practices that further land regeneration and that reciprocally heal our communities. Ceci is the executive director of BK ROT, R-O-T, which offers a youth and bike-powered food waste collection and composting service. Ceci has pursued community-driven agroecology and land regeneration work in Puerto Rico and Mexico, and co-facilitated a climate resilient farming workshop at Soul Fire Farm in upstate New York. Through apprenticing at Soul Fire Farm and volunteering at Hattie Carthen Urban Farm in Bedford-Stuyvesant and home growing, they deepened their relationships with plant friends. Ceci is a co-coordinator of Interlocking Roots, a network of QT, BIPOC farmers and land workers. They have also worked with leaders of these organizations on initiatives to make them more inclusive of queer and trans folks. So with that, I welcome Ceci.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm quickly just gonna share my screen. Let's see. And so I'm excited to, oops, wrong button, speak tonight a little bit about one of my favorite topics and really thinking about how we can work with the land in so many ways to address the climate crisis. And so I'm going to be speaking from my perspective working with BK Rob, but before I get into that, just want to share a little bit as to how I got here. And so for me, my community is a lot of queer and trans, Black, Indigenous, and Brown folks. And for me, this is us at the People's Climate March. And I started organizing with folks around the climate crisis. And for me, I really see the roots of the crisis as being white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy. And on the other side, when I think about what does climate justice look like, for me, it's about community, it's about the earth, it's about solidarity, it's about leadership of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people, and it's also about accountability and reciprocity. I had the privilege of working in the Lower East Side for a couple of years as part of the good old Lower East Side and with LES Ready, and really saw the power of communities organizing together to strengthen our resiliency. And I grew up in a more rural area in Massachusetts and had a lot more access to the land. So being here in Lenape-Canarsie lands of now New York City, I was really called into gardens. And so I started getting more involved in gardens as well as composting with BK Rot. And I ended up actually leaving the city because I was like, I need more space with the land, and really believing that when we work more closely with the land, we are able to not only make our communities more resilient, but also prepare ourselves for what's to come and in healing the land. And I did an apprenticeship with Soul Fire Farm before. And Soul Fire Farm is a project that really uplifts a lot of ancestral wisdom and knowledge that Black and Brown communities have, and Indigenous communities, when it comes to regenerative agriculture and all of these land-based practices. And I left for some time to work also with queer and trans projects in Borinquen or Puerto Rico, as well as in Mexico, even doing bioconstruction. And I think for me, it really solidified this lesson that when we gather as community to do work that is in harmony with the land, we heal ourselves, and we also build intimate place-based relationships that strengthen both our physical and our social resiliency. And then I was called back to work for BK Rot, the privilege of like holding this role and working with an organization I love so much. And so at BK Rot, we have young people who haul organic waste from businesses as well as households, and then we take it to our site, which is No Wastelands Garden, based in Bushwick, Brooklyn. and we transform it into compost. And all of our work is done by hand. And so you can see it's very arduous physical labor into transforming what can be considered waste into something that actually can go back to feed the earth and feed our communities. And we also host a drop-off from 12 to 3 every Sunday. And since the closure of a lot of composting options in the city due to budget cuts, we have been absolutely slammed at our weekly drop-offs. I think one Sunday we were receiving as much as 11 pounds of food waste a minute. And yeah, we've seen an overwhelming demand of people wanting to compost. And so in response, one thing that we did is we started partnering with different community gardens outside of our own, plus hiring more youth or our youth leaders who were trained by seasoned composters on our site, and then now we're essentially stewarding composting processes at different gardens. And that's increased our capacity, almost doubled our capacity essentially to process food waste in this time. Here are some pictures of our youth leaders at some different composting sites. And then afterwards, our finished compost is then sifted by Shack, and it goes out to into a lot of local community gardens, into people's backyard growing projects. We love seeing pictures. These are all pictures that people have sent us of where what our compost is supporting to grow. And so some things that I want to highlight about the regenerative power of compost is, for example, thinking about the high contamination of lead that exists through a lot of the soils, especially in North Brooklyn. You can see there's some higher rates there. Compost actually has this amazing capacity to bind to lead, so it makes it unavailable for plants to take it up. So the more compost that you can apply to your soils, the more you're remediating the soils. And it's actually, people used to think that sunflowers also bioaccumulate lead, but that's something soil scientists have recently disproved, sadly. And so really, compost is one of the few ways that I know that we can naturally actually help rebuild our soils. And then as Jaleesa noted too, I'm thinking about a lot of heat vulnerability that is going to happen through the climate crisis as well in communities that are more so impacted. We know through the application of compost as well can help increase our tree canopies. There's been studies that show direct links of applying compost and amending our soils, supporting to create wider and faster tree growth and bigger canopies. And so here are some of our youth leaders even learning that as well in compost application. And also applying compost to soils helps with water retention. So thinking about, again, the climate crisis bringing increased precipitation to New York City, applying compost to our soils is something that can really help with water retention. Here are some different examples that I'm sure we don't think about this. We usually think about growing for crops, but in California or in different places, they apply compost to hillsides to prevent landslides. Or there's even, instead of having sandbags, they're filled with compost to increase the capacity of to retain water and to reduce flooding. And I did some quick math based on scientists say that if you increase the soil's organic matter by 1%, it can hold 16,500 gallons per acre, down to a foot deep. And so I just did quick math thinking about all of the vacant lots that exist in New York City and all of our tree pits, and that's around 15.4 billion gallons of water that we could capture if we were to fully amend all of these places with compost. And for me, just to bring it back to our site again, I want to affirm that composting is something that was created by our ancestors, thinking about how this has been practiced for so many years. And in New York City, a place where we are so disconnected from our resources, from where either our water comes from or where our power comes from, where our waste goes, it's incredibly powerful to be taking on the responsibility and the accountability and also bringing it a step further, thinking about there are so many ways in which a lot of Black and Brown communities haven't been able to inform the systems or the structures in which we live. And so thinking about what happens when we give power to communities to determine our relationships with our waste, to reawaken these ancestral connections that we have with the land as a way to address like the climate crisis. I think I'm probably at my 7 minutes now, so I might just pause here.
Thank you so much, Ceci. I love that presentation, the inspiration and the significant challenging efforts. So I have a question, actually it's a few questions. If there are any key efforts that you would like to highlight and explain beyond the ones that you already have, why they're important, what kind of threats they address, and what kind of strategies are being used. Perhaps you could focus on success stories or particularly challenging matters.
So any particular like success stories that I want to highlight right now?
Either
Okay.
challenges or successes.
Yeah, so I guess one challenge that we're facing like throughout the city is definitely just the severe budget costs to our composting programs. This was over $30 million budget that got reduced to 2 million, and those 2 million were only really restored given the advocacy of the Save Our Compost Coalition and a lot of people who advocated on that behalf. And so right now, we have to really increase our local processing capacity. And I think that's whether we're investing locally in community gardens or these larger technological infrastructures. I was just recently listening to Domingo Morales, who's an amazing compost guru, and he was advocating that we're going to need action at all of these different levels if we're actually trying to compost all of the waste that we produce in New York City. Over 30% of our residential waste stream is compostable. And right now the majority is being sent to landfills where, as many of us know, that goes on to producing methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas.
Thank you. And are there some inspirational success stories that you would like to highlight additionally?
I mean, I was very inspired, and that's why I did return to New York for BK Rot. And I think also the Red Hook Compost Project is something that I also really admire, just because it's people coming together. A lot of the composting sites use technology, which I'm not saying it's like a bad thing, but I think there's something that's very powerful when we as community come together to put our own physical labor to transform something, because you are going beyond you're going beyond something that a machine can do and actually building these social ties, which are actually even incredibly important for building community and how we are going to respond to crises together in the future.
Thank you so much. And again, I look forward to our further discussions after our other panelists have presented. So I'm very pleased to introduce Alan Burchel, who goes by the pronouns he, him. Alan is a licensed engineer, lead AP, and green roof professional. He is principal of Brooklyn-based Urban Strong, a company focused on green building design and technology. Alan and his team work with developers, property managers, and building owners to cut energy costs, improve health and wellness, and reduce buildings' environmental footprint. Greening a city's built environment through green roofs and living wall gardens brings financial rewards along with diverse environmental benefits, better stormwater management, reduced greenhouse gas emissions, and stronger urban agriculture. Alan has spoken at the United Nations and appeared on MSNBC, and he consults with corporations, nonprofit groups, and municipal governments. And with that, it's my pleasure to hand the microphone over to Alan.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a real honor to be here today. Thanks, everybody. Truth be told, though, there's somewhere else I'd rather be right now. Around this time of year, I'm normally on a week-long annual camping trip with some of my best friends in Northern Ontario. And to give you a sense of the size of the park, it can fit almost 10 New York cities inside its boundaries. COVID kind of put a stop to that, but I'm very happy to have my health. So happy to be here, yeah, typically during these camping trips for a week, we hike and we paddle and we carry our canoes on our heads from lake to lake. Some days are a lot of hard work, particularly lugging my heavy camera gear around, but it's worth it for views like this. That red dot is Mars, by the way, and the rest is the Milky Way, in case anyone's wondering. And there's a sense of calmness that I feel when I'm sleeping amongst the trees under the stars. Over the course of the week, not only do I generally feel calmer, but I feel a relaxation in my shoulders and a reduced pressure around my eyes that I didn't realize was there. I can feel my blood pressure and my heart rate lowering. I've reduced anxiety that maybe I didn't realize I had while I was in the city. And I should say that I sleep like a champ. Mind you, maybe having no cell phone service helps a little bit with all of this. But really what I'm experiencing, these benefits are due to a phenomena called biophilia. The biophilia theory refers to an innate instinctive bond between humans and other living things. We as living creatures share a deeply rooted affiliation towards life. Simply spoken, life is attracted to other life. Now, this doesn't mean that we all love photographing bugs and sleeping in the woods. Biophilia is a general love of nature that's actually deeply seated within our species. We demonstrate this understanding when we say things like, oh, I've got to get out of town for the weekend. Oh, I want to head to the lake. I'm going to go to the park, go to the woods, head to the cottage, go for a hike. Some of us aren't aware or don't have the means to do all these things. So instead we spend our lives amongst the high rises and the blinking neon signs, all stressed out and depressed. What you're looking at there, in case you're wondering, is a rendering of the island of Manhattan circa 1609. Over the years, we've obviously shifted away from nature towards dense urbanization. And I should say, in many ways, for good reason, as the most sustainable way to house our growing global population is in fact in dense urban centers. There's a certain economy of scale of having us all close together. If we're not trucking goods across the country, there's less emissions. But with these dense urban centers, there's a good way to design our cities and there's a bad way. Incorporating nature into the design of our built environment is not just a luxury, but a sound economic investment in health and productivity based on well-researched neurological and physiological evidence. Nature is not just a nice art piece or amenity. When integrated into the design of buildings and cities, it has profound economic benefits. My colleagues at Terrapin Bright Green have produced a document called The Economics of Biophilia, which shows the undeniable positive impact that indoor greenery and outdoor greenery can have on everything from retail sales and learning comprehension to healing rates and company morale. There's three pillars of biophilic design. There's the most obvious one, which is nature in the space, quite literally. And then there's natural analogs. These are sort of the 1 degree of separation away from true nature. And then there's nature of the space. This is a bit more complicated to understand, so here's an example. This is the gift shop at the National Museum of Qatar. It's stunning, it's striking, it's clearly inspired by the Antelope Canyon in Arizona. So this is architecture mimicking nature and with great appeal and effect. This is actually an example of natural analogs because these are fake skylights made from LED screens mimicking nature. I'll talk more about the healthcare industry shortly. Over thousands of years, we've evolved and survived developing tools to help us flourish in nature. But in going from the island of Manhattan to what you see on our right-hand side, we've definitely overdone it, and it's time to strategically revert somewhat. And again, plants can and will help. Nature wants to help. She's trying to creep back into our lives and our cities via every nook and cranny. I just snapped this picture on Park Avenue last week. It's fighting her way up through a sidewalk crack. Nature wants to help, yet we spend an ungodly amount of money and time and energy beating her back. When in reality, if we stop resisting nature and start strategically allowing her back into our cities, the results can be astonishing. And given my love for both nature and big cities, I get a real sense of satisfaction working towards making these two loves less mutually exclusive and instead more blended. And there's a lot of benefits to doing this. As was mentioned already in the program, living wall gardens, bioswales, sidewalk tree pit gardens, green roofs, these are all examples of green infrastructure. And green infrastructure technologies offer a wide array of tools for combating climate change and solving common urban center issues. They offer so many tools that I like to refer them as Swiss Army knives. Nature not only wants back into our cities, she wants to do a lot of work for us that we desperately need and with very little repayment from us. In fact, when selling green roofs to CFOs or developers, I like to put it in terms they can understand. So I like to somewhat joke that nature wants to be our very hardworking, unpaid intern. If we just let nature into our cities under our own terms and in a controlled manner, she will be our air conditioner, our air purifiers, our humidifiers, our water purifier, our art gallery curator, our therapist, farmer, firefighter, waste stream manager, the list goes on. Green roofs offer unique benefits depending on the host building. For example, on the school in the West Village, the green roof offers a living classroom that provides content for curriculum spanning biology, physics, health and nutrition, social studies. Students exposed to nature on a regular basis find that their ADHD is held in check. And not surprisingly, the alumni of this school find the green roof to be a much better space for fundraiser events than the gymnasium. The positive impact biophilia has on our mental and physical health is not lost on the healthcare community. Patient rooms with sightlines to nature contribute to lower levels of the stress hormone cortisol and reduced blood pressure and reduced heart rate and quicker response to treatment. Here's a before and after image of a hospital roof we were pitching a few years ago upstate, since many patients look down on this roof. Urban area hospitals are building green roofs as healing gardens designed specifically to combat different disorders and conditions like Alzheimer's or autism. Compared to when the New York City sewer system was built about 150 years ago, there's now a dramatic amount of paved surfaces. It's now much rarer to find areas of exposed natural earth where the rainfall can just seep down into the earth's water table. Instead, it's intercepted by the hardscapes like sidewalks, roads, and rooftops, and it's funneled down into our sewer system. From 1984 to 2002, 9,000 acres of trees, bushes, and vegetative cover were paved over. That land, according to government analysts, could have absorbed 243 million gallons of water for each inch of rain that fell on the city. These days, as little as 1/20th of an inch of rain can overload New York City's combined sewer system. The main culprit is the combined sewer system, which combines sewage from buildings with dirty stormwater from streets. Once the wastewater treatment plant is at capacity, like shown here, rather than flood our homes and streets, the excess is allowed to just overflow into public waterways like the East River, the Hudson, and the Gowanus Canal. Each of the 460 red dots on this map represents a combined overflow point. Plants, vegetation can and will help with this. Green roofs, for example, sponge up the water that lands on building rooftops. 50% is used during photosynthesis and then just transpired up into the air. And the remaining 50% on average takes hours, sometimes days, to trickle down and hit the sewer. Green roofs and solar don't necessarily have to compete for rooftop valuable space. On a hot day, a green roof plant system keeps solar panels nice and cool, which means they produce more electricity. Green roofs can also be used to grow fresh food right in the neighborhoods that need them most. Roof to table also has dramatically less transportation emissions because we're not trucking the food across the country. Many people don't know there's actually an active commercial farm on the roof of Fenway Park that provides fresh, organically grown vegetables and fruit to Red Sox fans. I'm part of a nonprofit called the New York City Agriculture Collective. We have our 5th annual AgTech Week conference coming up in October. Check us out if you're interested at farming.nyc. This green roof sits above Beth Israel Hospital in Union Square, and the 4 condo towers that are above it now have a much nicer view looking down on that roof. Finally, living walls are a great way to bring plants into our daily lives as well. They don't take up nearly as much horizontal footprint as green roofs do. And this is important in cities like New York, where the real estate's very expensive. And they're usually more easily viewed by the public, which boosts their public benefits. Some of you may have seen these works of art by the famous French living wall designer Patrick Blanc. Some living walls can be integrated with a building's air conditioning system to act as a passive air filter and reduce the load on the equipment, reducing energy bills and extending the lifespan of the equipment. In this system, the plant root zones absorb volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, such as benzene, formaldehyde, xylene, acetone, and ammonia, to name a few. This is the largest living wall in the state of New Jersey. It's at the Rutgers Food and Health Building. Imagine starting and ending your day walking past that thing. In a cafe, living walls convey a sense of freshness and vibrance, which is great for branding, like this one in Soho that lets people connect with nature while they're grabbing their morning flat white. And finally, here's a freestanding living wall in our showroom in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. It's much better than carpeted cubicle wall, if you ask me. As a bit of a humble brag, we won an award of excellence for Best Indoor Living Wall of 2018 for this project we did in a commercial lobby in Union Beach, New Jersey. Thank you very much. I hope that this presentation has encouraged you and maybe your landlords to please stop wasting your rooftop space. It's very valuable in terms of potential. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. I appreciate the highly informative work on these inspiring and important projects. And I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
What are the current threats or obstacles to implementing green infrastructure in cities?
The biggest one I find for sure is education and awareness. I sometimes like to joke around and say that if building owners and developers just knew what I knew, if they could take a download of my brain, they would make the decision right away. But it's not a short elevator pitch. Green roofs, green infrastructure, they're very nuanced with their benefits. People say, what's your elevator pitch? And then I turn around and say, well, you got to give me a hint who I'm in the elevator with, because as you saw briefly, like a green roof to a school means a very different thing than a green roof to a factory or a hospital or a city council or whatnot. So making developers and decision makers understand the benefits and even sometimes quantifying what appears to be fluffier, softer, qualitative benefits. You know, unfortunately, you have to speak in a language they understand, and that usually comes down to money and ROI and payback. And in my experience, people, you know, a lot of the people on this presentation and attendees, they care about the environment. Unfortunately, to my frustration, it doesn't translate into decision making sometimes. Ultimately, a lot of decisions come down to money. So you need to take different benefits and help quantify them and understand what is the return on investment. And usually it's putting numbers to several layers of benefits and compressing them all down into one figure. And that's really hard because it's so custom depending on the building type, the green roof type, and the client type. So just conveying all these benefits in a digestible way is challenging.
Thank you. And that leads me to my next question. What are some success stories of green infrastructure in New York City that you could tell us about?
Sure. So if any of you followed the Climate Mobilization Act, I mean, that was a really big deal in New York City last year. I and several of my colleagues testified at City Hall in January in support of an array of bills that were encouraging or incentivizing green infrastructure and solar. And in April, it passed. I was there on the steps of City Hall. It was a beautiful moment. And then it was went into effect in November. Surprise, surprise, they found out that New York City is a bit of a challenging place. And so they were sort of taking their time to write the actual nuts and bolts of the legislation. And then COVID hit, so a lot of it's held up right now. But basically, two of the big highlights were Local Law 9294, which is going to mandate either green roofs or solar on all new construction in New York City and existing buildings as they go through turnovers of the rooftop. So not simple repairs, but if they do an extensive roof repair, they're going to trigger the law as though they're a new building and be required to install either green roof or solar. So I think we're going to see green roofs and solar appear all over New York City in the coming years. The other thing was Local Law 96 was passed on the same day, which enables building owners and vendors like us access to basically unlimited capital in order to install these retrofits. Because of course, everything can sound great, but if someone's focused on the ROI, their big question is, what is the upfront cash? How much does it cost? When am I going to make my money back? And suddenly all that goes away if you can tell them, hey, don't worry, we're going to give you all the capital that you need, and your loan payments back on that loan are always going to be less than the savings that you enjoy from the green infrastructure system you're putting in. So ROI being return on investment, sorry. And you know, so that's a big deal. They're mandating it and they're giving the money that's needed for this to happen. If that was a little much for everyone, we cover it extensively on our website, urbanstrong.com, and then do deep dives on the blog.
Thank you so much, and we'll have plenty of time for additional questions. So it's my pleasure to introduce our last speaker, Nikita Scott, whose pronouns are she, her. Nikita left her native Scotland to chase waves around the world. Today, she is chair of the New York City chapter of the Surfrider Foundation. She began volunteering with Surfrider during the victorious 2016 campaign to defeat a planned liquefied natural gas LNG terminal at Port Ambrose off the coast of New York City. As chapter chair, Nikita has worked to grow Surfrider New York City by encouraging an inclusive community, developing strategic partnerships, and expanding the chapter's environmental agenda. Surfrider New York City, along with 350 Brooklyn, was one of 5 groups that led the coalition to defeat the proposed Williams NESE fracked gas pipeline, which would have run underwater from Raritan Bay in New Jersey to the Rockaways. Nikita represents the New York City chapter within the People's Climate Movement of New York City. And with that, Nikita, I look forward to your presentation.
Great, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. I'm just gonna share my screen. Hopefully that goes okay. Great, can you all see it? Perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, so as I was kindly introduced, my name is Nikita Scott. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the chair of the New York City chapter of Surfrider. We are an organization that advocates for the protection and enjoyment of our ocean, waves, and beaches, and we do so through a powerful grassroots activist network. We're actually all volunteers here in New York City, myself included, and that's one of the real sort of powerful pieces of the work that we do, is that we're all volunteers. We try and remove all the barriers that might exist to getting involved in activism and standing up for your community, particularly when it comes to our coastlines and our oceans. And it's definitely something that has grown from a very small group of volunteers. So the origin story of Surfrider was actually that there were a group of about 5 surfers back in the 1980s, and they identified that their beaches were dirty. They were having issues with private land taken over, or private developments taken over, so they weren't able to access their beaches. There was all these things happening, and no one in their perception was taking any action. So they took it upon themselves to take action, and that was really what has born Surfrider Foundation into what it is now. So we're now 80 chapters across the country, and we're all dedicated to our mission to ensure clean water and healthy beaches for all. I personally got involved about 5 years ago now. I come from Scotland, where I did learn to surf in Scotland. We have pretty decent waves there. And I was traveling all around, and I was very much determined to surf as many beaches and be present in any bodies of water as possible. And as I was circulating the globe, I started to identify that there were actually quite a lot of common issues that I was seeing when I was in the ocean. There was pollution, there was litter, there were sometimes beach access issues, there was threats from fossil fuel infrastructure. It didn't really actually matter where I was in the world. These common threats were coming through again and again and again. And for anyone who has spent time in the water or surfed themselves, it's an incredible moment. It's some of the best moments of my life. And a lot of my journey when I was traveling is actually not memories of me being on land, but memories of me being in the water, looking back at land. And I think that connection was just very much strengthened during that period of time. And the people that you surf with are often the people that you will become closest to in your life as well, because you're just simply out in the ocean for so long and you're bonding. And it's really that combination of the connection to the water and the connection to the people that I think holds the Surfrider community together in this common mission. So the New York City chapter is actually the largest chapter in the Mid-Atlantic region now since 2018. So we've had huge growth in the New York City area, which is all down to people like yourselves who are coming in and getting involved. We're doing lots of different things, and I'm going to take you on a little tour of some of the programs and campaigns that we have going on and dip in here and there so that you can get some details. And the reason that I wanted to give you kind of an overview of what we've got going on is because so much of what we're doing is trying to, one, make sure that we're responding to the threats that are there and are risky for our ocean and our coastlines, but we're also trying to make sure that we're having programs and campaigns that resonate with people so that you feel motivated and inclined to get involved in your community. So here we have one of our Blue Water Task Force members. So we have a team of community scientists who go out into Rockaway at 2 testing sites, and they actually test the water quality year round. So we actually just in the previous presentation, Alan set me up perfectly because he talked about the sewer outflow. It's actually recommended that when there's heavy rain, you don't go into the water near New York City for usually about 3 days just to be super safe so that there's not sewage in there. Well, our team is out there year round. The city will test between May and Labor Day because that's the beach time. But surfers and many other recreational ocean users and just many people and animals in general are in this water all the time. So it's great to have that data set so that we can keep people safe year round. And again, this is a volunteer team that do this on an ongoing basis. We also have our Surfing for the Environment youth program. So as we were getting more and more involved in our campaigns and programs in Rockaway, we actually took a little bit of a sidestep from our mission to be thinking about the water. And we realized that, you know what, the community is a huge part of what we do as well. And that has really also been a kind of direction that we've taken in a lot of our work as we've been thinking about climate justice and environmental justice in a much more integrated way in the work that we do. And we realized that when we were working in the community, so many of the young people in the community who live there, and many of us don't live in Rockaway, but they didn't have access, they couldn't surf, they didn't know how to swim. It was actually dangerous for them to be near the water. And so much of that was because they just weren't given the opportunity or didn't have the resource. So we have now launched a youth program to help support that, and we combine it with a beach cleanup so that we're able to help also integrate that ocean stewardship and conservation ethos as well, so that these young people can grow up to be the future generation of coastal defenders. We have a few pictures here. You can see here our Port Ambrose liquefied natural gas campaign that we mentioned. And we do some plantings in the dunes to make sure that the storm resiliency projects in Rockaway are continuing to thrive. The dunes are a very important part of protecting the community from storm surge, and it's important that we continue to maintain and protect them. And this brings me, as we're thinking about Rockaway and the fossil fuel campaigns that we have going on, this brings me to the Williams Pipeline. So the Williams Pipeline is actually what we can already consider a huge victory. So I'm telling you this a little bit retroactively, but I did want to take a moment just to walk you through this, because this campaign was an incredible example of what it takes to be able to really be a pipeline and for a community to come together to be able to do that. And I want to give a shout out. I saw some names that I'm familiar with, because this was a coalition of organizations that came together to do this, and years of very, very hard work. And some people I saw were on the line today. But essentially the Williams Pipeline was going to be built between New Jersey through the Raritan Bay, and it was going to hook into the Rockaway delivery ladder pipeline over here that's already built. And you can actually see on the map that there's already pipelines that are in existence in that route that were only running at what was estimated around 50% capacity. There was no need for this pipeline, and that was disputed heavily throughout the campaign. And we were particularly perturbed by this because it was going to involve trenching the entire ocean seabed along this huge amount of like 20 plus miles, and they were going to be, you know, dredging up all the soil underneath that had contaminants in it. It was going to be disturbing the wildlife and marine life, and we've had an upsurgence of, for example, whales, humpback whales coming into this area. It was going to completely destroy the crustaceans and the oysters in that area, and it was actually, we were told that there was a chance that they might not even ever come back. So for us, that was completely devastating, and it definitely was something that was worthy of all our community efforts and our coalition efforts. And you can see here, I don't have time, unfortunately, to take us all the way through the campaign, so it doesn't give it full justice, but you can see here that it was a long, long fight. And it morphed from taking on the pipeline and getting Cuomo and lobbying Cuomo to try and stop this, to eventually having it stopped twice. And then it actually became a fight against National Grid. So once it had been stopped a couple of times, National Grid also got involved, and there was a moratorium, so that National Grid were actually kind of holding us all at ransom, being like, you're not getting any more fuel unless you know, stop your fight. But we did not listen to them, and we continued to press on. And then this year, right around just, you know, the pandemic was in full swing and everything, and we got the incredible news that we had won this fight. And it was huge, and it will continue to be, I think, one of Surfriders and our coalition allies' most impressive victories, because we took on the fossil fuel industry and National Grid, and we won. So something to celebrate. I just want to be mindful of time, so I'm going to take us through these like a little bit more quickly. But our Drilling is Killing campaign is also in association with Stopping Fossil Fuel Infrastructure. It is a national campaign, but we do believe that it's essentially one ocean, and we want to make that we protect our wildlife that migrate up from areas that are more at threat from oil and offshore drilling, such as down in the Virginia area, which we thankfully have recently been told that there will not be offshore drilling. But there's also places in the world that are currently at risk, like the Arctic Refuge. And just because it's not right in our doorstep, we do want to make sure that we're doing our part to be able to push through reform and stop this from happening. And one of the things that we do is we actually go down to DC as volunteer lobbyists every year, and we speak to elected officials to try and get this and many other campaigns and agendas supported by our elected officials at the federal level. And then lastly, we have our Rise Above Plastics program. So Rise Above Plastics is kind of what it says. We want to make sure that we encourage people to start thinking beyond just using plastic in their everyday lives. One component of our Rise Above Plastics campaign is our beach cleanups. We want to be able to actually go out and clean the plastic and all the debris off the beaches. And we do that with tens of thousands of volunteers and hundreds of cleanups across the country. But really, when we think about it, that's not really stopping the problem at the root. So we also have to be thinking about our reform in plastic pollution. How can we get plastic bags banned? It takes 10 to 20 years for them to grade. How can we have better opportunities for fishing line to be discarded more responsibly? So we also work heavily on the advocacy part, and also work with local businesses so that we can help ingrain these sustainable practices, all that they do. And just here, I wanted to leave you with a visual that this is our campaign that we have right now in Rockaway. It's called the Respect Rockaway campaign, and we have partnered with Jamaica Bay Rockaway Parks Conservancy to have the Respect Jamaica Bay campaign this year. And these messages are they're on ferries, they're on bus stops, they're at JFK. The idea being that we are reminding visitors into the community that they should respect the community and make sure that they protect the beach, they protect the bay, and they also protect the community. And that's identifying the issues of plastic pollution, the water safety that we mentioned, making sure they're keeping the beach clean, all these things that we really want to make sure people keep top of mind so that we can be helping the community thrive. So I'll pause there because I feel like I went a bit over time there, so thank you.
Oh, no problem. Many thanks, Nikita, for a very inspirational presentation on your powerful initiatives. So I have a few questions also. What role does community activism play in protecting our waters and other natural resources?
Well, thank you. I mean, I love this question because I feel like certainly something that was very surprising to me when I first got involved is just like how powerful it is for people in communities to stand up for what they believe in. And when you're a community activist, you're typically, you're not paid, you're doing this off your own back, you're doing this because your lives and your livelihoods depend on it. And that can come through. And I think that that's something that elected officials, media, decision makers really do want to listen to. And I think it's also important because when we're thinking about the work that we do, we want to make sure that the voice of the community is represented. Like, who's better to make recommendations on how to build communities, how to create this harmony between people and nature than the people who live there themselves? And I think it shouldn't necessarily be like we're building for communities. It needs to be that we're building and working with communities when we're doing this type of work.
Thank you. I was also wondering, Surfrider and its allies cultivate a connection between science, nature, and community to drive change. So what does that entail and how does it impact your work?
Yeah, I mean, the issues that we are up against they're usually huge and they're very complex. And I don't think it's possible for any of us to do this work on our own. And that's why our coalition building is just so integral to everything that we do and working with organizations. And then even when you take it down and you look like, at the next layer, you also need diversity and you need all different types of people within these coalitions because you want to bring in the arts so that you can have vibrant, visible representation of your campaigns, and you want to boost morale and keep people engaged, especially because these campaigns can go on for years. And then you want to have the science and the data because that's going to be what gives weight to the activist voice when they speak to the elected officials and they go in through the layers of government. You have to be backed with that credibility and legitimacy because the people that you're up against, the fossil fuel companies, all of that, they have a lot of money, they have a lot of influence, they have a lot of resources at their fingertips, and you have to match that. And you're doing it as a community activist with a lot less resources. And the way that I think you can make up for that is by combining your talents, your skills, and all the people within a community coming together to be able to contribute what they can.
Thank you so much. And so with that, I just again wanted to express my sincere gratitude to all four of you for your insightful and inspiring work. I want to go out and surf now and do composting and get a green roof and do some environmental justice. So, this is all really good, really important efforts. And now the floor is open for questions from the audience that have been submitted through the chat and curated for me. So I'll start with Jaleesa, our first speaker. And one of the questions for Jaleesa was, how can people listening support communities, especially vulnerable to climate change in New York?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think Nikita kind of got at this a little bit just now. For environmental justice communities, we've been facing a bunch of different environmental burdens for decades, and climate change is just exacerbating this. But the people who are living in these communities and even working there and they really understand what's going on in the communities. And have solutions to addressing the unique kind of vulnerabilities within their community. So I think, talking with your local community-based organization and just trying to work with them rather than, coming into the community and thinking that you have all the solutions is always a great way to start, to follow the lead of grassroots organizations and people who are doing the work in their communities.
Just one follow-up before I move on to Ceci. And also, I think maybe some of the other panelists actually would maybe like to chime in. Would any of other of you have any insights into how people listening can support vulnerable communities in New York?
I I'd be happy to chime in. I mean, you speaking to your local councilors and making them understand that access to green space is important, and feel free to borrow any of my analogies, particularly the Swiss Army knife, because so many different technologies or investment opportunities are usually singular in function. But if you can, for example, if there's like a building with a big blank brick wall that's kind of doing nothing, like, you know, art, like graffiti art, I love graffiti art, and that definitely serves a great purpose. Some of these blank walls could be covered in greenery, and it doesn't have to be a super expensive living wall. It could be something as simple as letting ivy train up it. There's ways to sort of help that along in a way that doesn't destroy the brick. So it's sort of a, if you build it, she will come, you know. And so there's ways to easily, cheaply build greenery on a wall. But, you know, talking to city council and letting them know the greenery is important. At things like, why do sidewalks have to be so wide in so many parts of the city, including some of these areas experiencing these challenges? You know, if you put your back against one building and look across the street, you'll see it's just like 20 feet of sidewalk, then the entire however many lanes of road, and then another 20 feet of sidewalk to hit the other building. We don't need all that paved surface. And so if you started, you know, requesting more tree pits and tree gardens and bioswales, that's a way to bring tree canopy, shading, clean and cool the air, and you know, these, I know those fancy hospital rooms, they look kind of expensive, and you know, not everyone can see a green roof even if it's built, but you know, the benefits of biophilia can be experienced just with a sight line to nature. And this can be something as simple as a tree planted somewhere along the road. And there's just, as you saw in, I can't remember, I think it was Jaleesa put the lack of vegetation map up there and the lack of tree canopy. And usually those do correlate with areas that are economically distressed. And so if you could put more greenery and tree canopy there, the air will be cleaner, cooler, and it'll boost mental health. So if you talk to your local council members and vie for that some of the funding go into that, that's one effective measure.
Thank you. Now I have a question for Ceci. And again, the other panelists, if while you're listening to Ceci's answer, if you feel like you could add any perspective from your own initiatives, then please unmute yourself after Ceci. So Ceci, how can people pressure the city to bring back the compost budget? Are there data that can help us convince the city that composting makes economic sense and needs to come back?
Yeah, so, and just to get at the other question too, I think it's really about like when we allow communities to determine their own structures or meeting with communities. I mean, there's so much, no one knows what you need more than like yourself, right? So just thinking about that power and autonomy and thinking about how our communities can like reshape themselves. And for this next question, I mean, it makes so much more sense. What New York City pays tipping fees at landfills, and they pay so much to truck all of this waste, compostable waste, outside of our city. And so if you think about it, 34% of the residential waste stream is compostable, and a lot of that type of waste is heavy and wet. And so it's what's going to weigh the most in bringing it to landfills. And so in that sense, you could be then, there are specific numbers that I'm not remembering at the top of my head, but of how much money the city would be able to save. And also creating organics recycling or composting also creates a lot more local workforce opportunities than jobs if it's just being sent to the landfill. So I think there's those other also incentives too, especially thinking about right now and the surges of like unemployment that are happening as well. But I'll also say that the city council budget, it was very difficult to get the $2 million that was allocated. And I think that was because many people most likely on this webinar and many others did call their local elected officials, and there are more actions that are coming up. I guess I also want to note quickly, in case people aren't aware, but a few of the New York City compost project sites, like I mentioned, the Red Hook Compost Project, the Lower East Side Ecology Center, as well as Big Reuse, are actually currently facing potentially the end of their leases from Parks, and Parks has not been willing to re-sign their leases. And so that's another campaign that we're soon going to be asking folks to support and putting pressure on the Parks Department. They want to convert some of those lots into parking spaces, right? But anyways, I could go on more about that, but there'll definitely be need for advocacy there as well.
Thank you. And if any of the other panelists want to chime in about how to pressure the city to support their budgets and what kind of data are available, then please unmute yourself. I can also go on. I have a question for Nikita. So Nikita, we are drowning in plastics, and yet it is so hard to wean ourselves of them as consumers. Are there any legislative efforts that are going on right now that we can support that will move more responsibility to manufacturers?
Yes, that's actually lines up nicely with the call to action handout. So there is a legislation right now called the Break Free from Plastic Act that does have some more responsibility to corporations baked in there. I think it's becoming more and more certain that as much as we'll do on the individual level, and I think some people are really doing excellent, and there's more thoughtfulness in everyday behavior. And I think there's more options now as well that are more accessible, because I think that's also another important part to remember, is that sometimes, with plastic use, it was also about making sure that people were actually able to access affordable options for reusables. So we're doing everything we can, I think, on an individual level, and people are making progress, but we really do have to get the companies and the corporations to be more responsible and start making change at these high levels that are going to be hugely impactful and complement the individual effort as well. So yeah, the Break Free from Plastic Act is in the call to action handout that I think is circulating right now. We have a petition right now that you can all sign, and it sends a little letter to your elected official. When you put in your zip code, it will identify who you can send it through. It is at the federal level as well, and we're hoping to continue to see more such legislation at the state and city level as well. We did have the bag fee that was actually successfully put through. It's hit a little bit of a blocker right now due to a lawsuit, and also COVID-19 has also had an impact on people's comfort level of using plastics too, and some of the necessary things that do have to be used right now. So there's a little bit of complexity in there right now, but we're still very much making sure that we are focused on areas of plastic use that we can help advise on and can help reduce. So first call to action though is please do sign that petition.
Thank you, and I'd like to invite the other panelists. I know we have already discussed some of this, but if you have anything to add as to roles or way to motivate individuals through companies, through corporations, to governments to act in a way that would benefit your separate efforts, please unmute yourself.
So I'll go. I mean, everyone in New York City is either renting or owning. If you're renting, maybe start asking your landlord, what is the energy efficiency of this building? Soon they're not going to have a choice. The city's going to start requiring what's called energy benchmarking, kind of like how you see the letter grades outside of restaurants. They're going to start doing that on buildings in the city. And, some landlords just might not care, but this could have an impact then, when it comes time for the next wave of rentals, and especially right now during COVID with vacancies being the highest they've been in like 20 years, landlords are gonna feel the squeeze to, attract tenants. And then secondly, for anyone that happens to be looking for a place to live, maybe ask, hey, what is the opportunity to access nature or green space in this building? Same thing goes for condo and co-op boards. Like an indoor gym is nice, and maybe some upgrades to the lobby and the parking structure and whatnot are nice, but we've seen a spike in requests from condo and co-op boards for our green roof design build services, because people are saying, look, because of COVID, either they're trapped inside and they want to go access nature but not go out into the public parks, understandably so. And so they're coming around to the idea that, hey, if only the roof of our building wasn't black, hot, smelly, sticky tar, and was instead actually green space where we can hang out and drink rosé and watch the sunset, or grow tomatoes and grow food, or just relax. So start asking your condo and co-op boards, hey, what's our opportunity to bring green space? And the same thing with your landlords.
Thank you. Jaleesa and Ceci, do you have anything to add about roles or ways to get action from individuals, companies, corporations, governments that would better support your initiatives? And if you want to think about that for a little bit, that's fine. You can come back to it. I do have a question for Jaleesa. So we've just been talking about opportunities, but the reason nothing, sometimes happens is because of barriers, right? And obstacles and challenges. So, and this can also apply to the other panelists if they want to chime in. Jaleesa, what are the biggest barriers to getting New York's leaders to make its communities more resilient?
That's a great question. So I think some of the biggest barriers in general, at least at the federal level, is that the current federal administration is just rolling back environmental regulations, like close to 100, in a time when we just need stronger climate protections. But in New York, at least on climate legislation with the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which legislates commitments to reduce 85% of greenhouse gases emissions by 2050. We're making progress on that. So we need legislation like this at the federal level that follows the leadership of grassroots environmental justice organizations, and really, as well as like a commitment to make sure that we're protecting the most vulnerable populations from climate change. So addressing the historic environmental burdens in EJ communities, and really just pushing for more progressive climate legislation like the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act.
Thank you. And so moving on, Ceci, if you want to talk about barriers, I know you've already mentioned many of these points. Please go ahead. But there's also a question here, Ceci, can you imagine your model in other parts of Brooklyn, and what would it take for other parts of Brooklyn or greater New York City or even the United States to adopt your model?
Yes, I definitely could see that happening. Actually, some of us, the founders of BK Rot, as well as the director, Meredith, the director from Common Ground Compost, are looking at starting like a micro hauling trade association to make this type of work something that is more accessible. And micro hauling is essentially using bikes, e-trikes, or very low emission vehicles in order to move organic waste. And then there's the question of processing as well. And so I think, on our end, like people have said, we want to BK Rot here or something like that, but it's like the thing about us is being very neighborhood specific. So I think for us, it's like what we would love to see is like different initiatives like our starting that create good green jobs for youth and young people who are local to those communities. And honestly, composting can be something that you need minimal tools for, right? Like our windrow systems, you just need a pitchfork and a shovel. And so it's very accessible. It's not like you have to create a bin system or something like that. And these are jobs also that don't require, or some people have college education, but like that's not a barrier to entry into this workforce. And so I think it's a lot about in New York City, I think the biggest thing is just like access to space and land to get that started, as well as having supportive infrastructure to allow communities to move into those roles. But hopefully through some of the groundwork that we're going to be creating, it's going to be something that like more communities can start similar projects.
I would just like to tag on a little bit there. I mean, Ceci, the idea of micro hauling, I think, is so great. I mean, anytime that you're using people to do things and you're spreading out the effort in a more decentralized manner, it's so much better. I mean, we're seeing that with rooftop solar. I mean, it makes so much more sense intuitively, rather than, to make an extreme example, what sounds safer and more sustainable? Having one central power plant in the middle of the United States and running transmission lines and powering all the homes from this one plant, never mind what a security risk it is, or completely decentralized. And imagine if everybody is producing their own power on the roof of their building, growing their own food on the roof of their building, triking around, compost. And then when you get more people involved and it's more visible and more decentralized and spread around, you get more participants in the movement. That's a groundswell. That's how grassroots movements get started. I mean, rather than one big complicated machine doing all this work, imagine if you could replace that machine with 50 people, you know, unskilled workers, people coming out of the criminal justice system that now have a job, and then their friends ask them, hey, what are you doing? Oh, I'm triking compost around. I mean, word spreads that way and people are more aware. If there were solar panels in every building in the city and green walls and green roofs and people moving compost around and volunteering, what if there was some sort of like mandate that everyone has to spend so many hours a month, you know, picking plastic up out of the ocean? I mean, that'd be incredible. And if for no other reason than the PR and the awareness raising, like, what are you doing Thursday night? Oh, it's, you know, it's my turn this month to go pick up plastic in the ocean. That sparks a discussion and gets things going. And I love the micro hauling. That's really cool.
Yeah, and I'll just add really quickly, I think it gets to your last question too about, I think that's like a very powerful way to create behavior change. I think when we're removed from our waste or from our resources, it's something that's out of sight, out of mind. But when, like, so for example, even engaging like these youth in this process, like they want to continue working with BK Rot. They're amazed at like this process of transformation. And I think also, you know, it just creates this closed loop. And when communities can actually see the benefits of the finished compost that once was waste, going into their gardens to grow fresh food, or the fact that, right, like thinking about, as I mentioned before, just a lot of the impacts of climate change and how compost can actively help mitigate those things, as well as increasing our soil's capacity to store carbon. There's just so many added benefits.
Thank you, Cece and Alan. So I think that now it's already 8:25, so it might be time to start thinking about wrapping up this amazing session. And I didn't warn you ahead of time, but I thought maybe each of the panelists might be able to give us a brief concluding remark. And it could be anything that you wanted, you know, something inspirational or something you'd like people to do, or just a thought that you had along the way. And I'll just give my brief concluding remark. And I think that this panel really, even though I'm well-versed in this field, I learned many new things today. And I certainly gained a better understanding of the importance of each of your initiatives and the considerable obstacles and threats that are involved. And also it's just very inspiring to see how the strategies that you're using are actually overcoming the many challenges. And so I think we can all leave here with tangible things that individuals can do, as well as just a greater sense of overall hope, which in this political climate can be, you know, something to really value. So I would just invite any of you, maybe we could start with Alan, and then anyone who wants to, Ceci or Nikita, or Jaleesa, just chime in with you know, we don't have a lot of time, but just a brief, you know, concluding remark that we can take with us for the evening.
I sometimes do these like pro bono lectures at high schools around the city, and one of the things I like to do is encourage students, or for that matter, career changers, and encourage them to seek out a career path in a double bottom line industry. That basically means, like, sure, if you want to work and make profit as like the overarching goal of the company, that's a single bottom line. But there are companies out there, and there's issues where, you know, you can have multiple or just other bottom lines, a nonprofit that helps the people, a nonprofit that helps the planet, but there are for-profit industries that help people or help the planet. And I would encourage the youth and anyone changing jobs to try and find a career path in this space. I tell the students, you know, the world doesn't need a million more Kardashians, and it doesn't need a million more face swap apps. You know, we don't need this. There's real problems out there that you can use cool tech to solve. If you like dealing with people, if you like being amongst nature, there's jobs, you know, for out there that you know, touch on all of those and utilize all of those skill sets and passion that you can have a career, pay your rent, pay your bills, but at the same time either help people, the planet, or, you know, or both. And I would encourage people to seek out these career paths and jobs.
Thank you. Nikita?
Thank you. I would say that I'll conclude a remark would be to embrace what you can do as a person on this planet to protect our natural resources and protect our communities. I think that sometimes you don't realize the impact that you can have until you actually get started. And the problem is that so many people don't even take that first step. Maybe they're intimidated, maybe it feels overwhelming, but we do have to do our part. And I think that the more that we can just take these small collective steps together, the bigger impact we're going to have on these like huge things that come our way, but things that we've proven that together we can overcome. And I would say as well, like a kind of sub part to that is that as you're getting involved, please do take the time to learn, like understand what's going on in these communities, speak to the leaders, speak to the organizations who are involved. You want to ensure that you're adding value where it's most needed. And I think so much of that is just having that patience, and to enter in that way where you're very humble and you're very open to how your role might take shape in these movements. Thank you for everyone's attention tonight.
See, Ceci or Jaleesa, you don't have to have a concluding remark, but I see that Ceci, you unmuted yourself, so I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, I'll just share a quote as well from, just gonna share my screen one last time. And I think for me, really, I think I might have mentioned this before, but for me getting into this work, I was thinking about how can I help heal the land? But through this process of doing this work, I've just found so much incredible healing for myself and affirmations for my whole being. And so leaving off with this quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer from Braiding Sweetgrass of action on behalf of life transforms because the relationship between self and the world is reciprocal. It's not a question of first getting enlightened or saved and then acting. As we work to heal the earth heals us. And I think for me, it's just when we give back, we receive so much more than what it is that we're giving. And so I think that's really like the message that I want to leave with you all tonight.
Thank you so much. I love her. She's a wonderful author. So Jaleesa, will you take us out?
Yeah, and thanks, Ceci, for that quote. I wish we would have ended on that. But for me, I just want to remind everyone that it's like, it's not just about the environment. I talked about a lot of different like solutions for the environment and climate change, but it's really about, the people and our health. And, some people are suffering more than others because of just, the history of the US and just racist policies that have put disproportionate amount of environmental burdens in certain communities. But we can all work together to address climate change and just make healthier communities in general. So just want to remind, it's about the people and it's about the health of the people.
Thank you so much. So in conclusion, thank you once again, Jaleesa, Ceci, Alan, and Nikita for presenting your important work and inspiring all of us. Thanks everyone for being such a great audience and coming up with such tremendous questions. Thank you for all the people working behind the scenes who did so much to make this a success. And one last thanks to 350.org who have some final comments.
Great, thank you. Wow, I learned so much. That was so inspiring. Thank you once again for joining us tonight, to our moderator and panelists, to Shay and our partners at the library, and to all of you and your attention and engagement on these issues. If you'd like to save the chat to use the links for reference, you can open the chat, click the ellipses in the bottom right corner, and hit Save Chat. You can also head to the resources section on 350brooklyn.org for tonight's handout. Save the date for our next Climate Wednesday session, September 16th, Green Collar Jobs, Making a Living, Forging a Better World. And join us for our 350 Brooklyn community monthly meetings, the second Thursday of each month. Thank you so much, everyone.
For detailed information on the Natural Allies event and nature-based solutions, go to the 350 Brooklyn website under Resources, where a press release, speaker biographies, and a handout with ideas, action items, and other resources are available.